Well, many thanks for speaking to Times Now, Dr. Edward Fishman. He's the author of Choke Points, American Power in the Age of Economic Warfare. He's also director of the Center for Geoeconomics at the Council of Foreign Relations, and he's a former Russia and Europe sanctions lead in the US State Department. First and foremost, I'd like to read something that you've written for the benefit of our viewers, and you wrote this in the New York Times on the 26th of March. You said, by closing the Straits of Hormuz for a few weeks, it has secured sanctions relief that in some respects surpasses what it achieved via the 2015 nuclear deal. This is Iran that you're speaking of. You've also said that the United States has long weaponized the financial system to advance its geopolitical aims. Iran has now learned to do the same with the world's most vital energy choke point, and it has done so by borrowing a playbook developed by the United States top court. So therefore, in that context, my first question to you is, if all Iran has been asked to do right now is to open up the Straits of Hormuz to effect a ceasefire, has Iran scored a strategic victory over the United States as well as Israel?
Yes. I think if this war ends with Iran still in possession of 600 kilograms of highly enriched uranium, with sanctions lifted, which was one of those 10 points that apparently Trump has said is a good framework for a deal, and critically, if Iran has established a toll booth at the Strait of Hormuz, charging up to $2 million per ship for commercial vessels going through the Strait of Hormuz, that is a massive strategic victory for Iran. I wouldn't jump to conclusions. I don't know if that's where we're going to end up. I do think that Trump was looking for an off-ramp last night and didn't want to follow through on his threat. But if that is where we end up, make no mistake, that is a major, major strategic defeat for the United States.
So, Dr. Fishman, we've actually seen goalposts change as far as President Trump is concerned. It began with regime change, then fomenting a revolution from within Iran, ending Iran's nuclear program, dismantling its missile capabilities. And then the precondition for a ceasefire eventually was Iran opening up the Straits of Hormuz. So it begs the question, did America as well as Israel not anticipate that Hormuz was Iran's leverage and would be used as such?
Yeah, look, I think everyone knew that the Strait of Hormuz was an essential choke point, right? You've got 20% of global oil and 20% of liquefied natural gas that went through that very narrow waterway every single day before this war began. I think the miscalculation was that U.S. officials thought that for Iran to close the strait, they would have to lay hundreds, if not thousands, of sea mines, basically making it so that no ship could go through the Strait of Hormuz, not even Iran's own oil tankers. What Iran did, which is frankly an innovation in economic warfare, just by using relatively cheap drones and missiles and hitting a small number of ships, they changed the risk calculus of the entire global shipping industry and gave the Iranian government the ability to say, this ship goes through, this one doesn't, right? Effectively, again, serving as a gatekeeper or toll master of the Strait of Hormuz. That was something that really no major strategist in the United States or Israel saw happening.
Sir, do you believe that the reports that are now emerging about Iran possibly levying $2 million a vessel for clearance of passage through the Straits of Hormuz, some reports even suggest that Iran could charge $1 a barrel as well. Do you believe all this amounts to a violation of the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Seas, if indeed such a proposal is actually implemented?
Yes. Iran has no right to block the Strait of Hormuz. That is certainly illegal. What I will say, though, is that I don't think Iran necessarily has any compunction about doing it, right? They've already done it over the last month. They have extracted fees from some vessels that have gone through. And I think we need to think about this in economic terms, right? If you're an oil tanker that's carrying a couple million barrels of oil, and that oil is being sold for over $100 a barrel, maybe charging $1 or $2 a barrel doesn't feel like that much. It might not be that expensive for any single shipment of oil. But if you add it up for Iran, if they're charging $2 million a ship, that equals about $100 billion of additional revenue every single year for the Iranian government. So you have to ask yourself, if you were the Iranian government, would you charge that toll? Yes, you would, right? I mean, that's a huge amount of revenue that this country desperately needs now that they've got a lot of reconstruction to do. They've been under sanctions for 20 years. I think that's why it's logical for Iran to try to do this. The question is, will the United States, will the international community allow Iran to do this?
And would the international community and the United States in particular interpret Iran's levying of fees for safe passage of tankers through the Straits of Hormuz as a breach of the 10-point agreement that's been agreed upon for a ceasefire? And do you believe that might result in an escalation and a return to the conflict?
Yeah, look, I can't speak for the U.S. government. In the 10-point ceasefire proposal that Iran put forward, it's very clear that Iran retains control of the Strait of Hormuz.
Correct.
I saw reports also this morning that President Trump apparently has said that maybe the U.S. and Iran would jointly extract fees from ships going through the Strait of Hormuz. I think the details are yet to be finalized. But I think to your point, I don't think this is necessarily the end of the war, right? It's if you read the 10-point ceasefire, at face value, it does amount to a major strategic defeat for the United States. It amounts to a new strategic status quo in the Gulf that I don't think is tolerable for countries like Saudi Arabia or the UAE or Qatar. And so there's a real question I have. Is this just a temporary truce that's going to lead to a resumption of hostilities in the next few weeks or few months?
And do you believe that Trump's proposal of a joint access or joint control of the Straits of Hormuz with Iran is actually realistic?
Realistic? I would have said no if we had been talking about this a month ago. But this is how Trump thinks, right? I mean, when Jensen Huang, the CEO of NVIDIA, came to Trump's office and says, let me sell semiconductors to China, Trump said, sure, if you give me a cut, give the U.S. government a 10 or 15% cut. This is how Trump thinks. And so it doesn't surprise me that a clever Iranian leader would look at Trump's track record and say, how do I get him to agree to this? Well, maybe I'll give the U.S. a cut. Maybe that's something that will appeal to Donald Trump. So, I mean, it does feel a little fanciful, but is it impossible? No.
It's not impossible. Now, Dr. Fishman, you've also extensively documented how America has weaponized the financial system. And therefore, there's another threat now coming from the American president. And he said, and I'm quoting him, a country supplying military weapons to Iran will be immediately tariffed on any and all goods sold to the United States of America, 50% effective immediately. There will be no exclusions or exemptions. This is what President Trump has said a short while ago on Truth Social. Who do you think he's speaking of? Is he speaking of China here? Is he speaking of Russia?
Look, I mean, it's Russia and China that are providing support to Iran, primarily Russia, frankly, although China as well. Look, I don't think this is a credible threat. Just a couple months ago, the Supreme Court in the United States made it impossible for Trump to levy emergency tariffs. So my assumption is if Chinese and Russian leaders are looking at that tweet, or Truce Social post, I guess it is, I would be surprised if they take it very seriously. Look, Trump could, for sure, levy more devastating economic weapons, financial sanctions. The U.S. dollar is a much more potent weapon than U.S. import tariffs. Could Trump impose sanctions on Chinese companies or Russian companies that are aiding Iran? Yes, he could. And in fact, I think it would be wise for him to do so. But for whatever reason, Trump has preferred tariffs to America's more potent weapon, which is financial sanctions.
You mentioned the setback that Trump received at the hands of the American Supreme Court. He had used the IEEPA to also penalize India for buying Russian oil. And those tariffs, of course, were struck down. And then in the midst of this war, he announced a waiver for India's purchase of Russian oil to address the issue of shortages. And as much as Trump tried to claim that America did not rely much on the Straits of Hormuz, how much under pressure do you think he actually was to announce this ceasefire to keep global oil prices stable?
He was under enormous pressure. I can tell you, I just filled up my gas tank the other day and it's $5 a gallon. That's really expensive for us here in the United States. So it's intolerable, I think, for motorists, people driving around, but companies too. I mean, if you have extended period of oil prices over $100 a barrel, you are going to see inflation, which has been, a major problem in the United States now for a number of years. So I do think Trump was under a lot of political pressure to end the war. I think the other thing, too, is, the American people didn't really understand what Trump was trying to accomplish. You put this very well earlier. We saw vacillating goals between regime change and getting rid of Iran's nuclear program and degrading their missile capabilities. I don't think the American people were ever really brought along on why this was important. So I do think he was under a lot of pressure. To your point about India, I mean, to me, this is quite astounding, right? I mean, Trump imposed a 50% tariff on India last summer.
Right.
And then he also threatened secondary sanctions against Indian refineries like Reliance and Indian banks who are processing payments for Russian oil. And then just a couple weeks into a war in which the U.S. chose the war of choice, to close the Strait of Hormuz, India is getting sanctions relief and saying, please buy Russian oil. Please buy all this Russian oil so that, we can ensure that oil prices go down. It's a very confusing message. And I do wonder if this weakens the deterrent effect of U.S. sanctions moving forward.
Now, during the conflict, Iran actually did manage to successfully target energy installations in the Gulf, including the Ras Laffan in Qatar. And those attacks, according to Qatari claims, wiped out about 17% of Qatar's LNG capacity for up to 5 years. Now, whose hand has all of this strengthened? Iran's own? And what about the Russians?
Look, I mean, the strikes on LNG specifically,
yes,
I think are very tragic, right? Because increasingly, the global economy is reliant on liquefied natural gas. The Europeans, in particular, had been buying their natural gas from Russia by pipeline.
Correct.
They're now phasing that out, justifiably so. They don't want to enrich Putin.
Yep.
But their main sources of LNG are both the United States and Qatar. Well, if Ras Laffan has sustained so much damage that it's going to be offline, or at least significant parts of it, for years, that's going to lead to sustained higher prices for energy in Europe, in Asia. Asian economies also depend on liquefied natural gas.
Correct.
To me, this was a bit peculiar on the Iranian behalf, because unlike oil, where we in the United States suffer from the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, with natural gas, America benefits, because we are self-sufficient here in the United States on natural gas. We are not dependent on a global price of liquefied natural gas, and we are a massive exporter of natural gas, of liquefied natural gas. And so U.S. companies are making a killing from the higher LNG prices around the world. But I thought this was a strategic blunder by Iran, weakened the Europeans. I think it weakened the Asian economies that might otherwise potentially be sympathetic to Iran in this conflict.
Now, some time back in The Guardian, you had actually written in complimentary terms about how India specifically had responded to President Trump's weaponization of tariffs. We had also kept our channels of communication open with Iran throughout this conflict to allow safe passage to at least 9 India-flagged tankers through the Straits of Hormuz. How do you think India has handled this entire situation in terms of protecting its own interests, its own energy security?
Look, I'm hesitant to assess any other country's, performance. I think from my standpoint, you look at how the world responded to Trump's tariffs last year. There were a handful of countries that said, we need to race to the negotiating table and cut a deal as soon as possible, even if it's a lopsided deal. Right? That's what the Europeans did. That's what the Japanese did. That's what the Koreans did. And look, if you compare that with what India did, which was not to do that, but rather to try to signal resolve, to diversify their economy, and to sort of have strategic patience. And I would also group Brazil into that category. They seem to end up a lot better off, frankly, than the EU, Japan, or Korea. And then if you look at China, which both did what India and Korea and Brazil did, but then also retaliated with the rare earth embargo, yes. China probably ended up best off. And so I think the world has taken a lesson from that. You saw earlier this year when Trump was threatening tariffs on the EU unless they sold him Greenland, the Europeans had a different response, right? They threatened to retaliate with their own tariffs and sanctions through this anti-coercion instrument, and very quickly Trump backed down. I also think Iran drew a lesson. Iran, when they were in the start of this war, when the U.S. and Israel were bombing their installations and literally killing their supreme leader, they retaliated by cutting off our access to energy and spiking oil prices. I mean, that also now has worked to get Trump to back down, to agree to a deal that, if you accept it at face value, is way better for Iran than the nuclear deal of 2015, right? Strengthens Iran. So I think there's a lesson that, the U.S. definitely is the world's most powerful economy, the most powerful state still, but not all powerful. And retaliation can, I think, rein in some of the worst impulses of the U.S. government.
So let me build on what you had mentioned about China. Since economic warfare is also a lot about leverage, where does all of this actually leave China? They've been watching very quietly, but how extensively armed is China to leverage its own economic power to punish when the situation presents itself? The United States of America, principally, it controls the world's supply chains. So how much leverage does China exercise in this entire situation to one day perhaps bite back America?
Sure. So look, I think if you would asked me this question 5 or 10 years ago and said, the Strait of Hormuz is closed. What does that mean for China? You would say this is a devastating blow for China. They're this massive economy. They depend on a huge amount of oil imports every single day. But look, Chinese leaders recognize this as a vulnerability and they stockpiled. They've got about 1.5 billion barrels of oil sitting in their strategic reserve. That's 4 times as much as we have here in the United States. And I think more to the point, China has spent the last several years putting hundreds of billions of dollars into clean energy technologies, solar panels, electric vehicles, batteries, wind technology. They've significantly reduced their own dependence on fossil fuels. And so China has been both more resilient domestically, but then I also think if this crisis leads countries in Europe and Asia and Latin America and Africa to accelerate their transition to clean energy technologies, to import more electric vehicles from companies like BYD, this is going to give China tremendous economic leverage, many more choke points that it can use for economic warfare moving forward if Xi Jinping decides to.
Finally, Dr. Fishman, where do you see all this headed? Do you believe that the ceasefire will hold? Do you think it's a very fragile 10 points that have been agreed on? How do you see this headed?
I think it's extremely fragile. Look, I think that this war was not going to end with a major win for the United States. Clearly, the U.S. and Israel sought to achieve regime change. And in some ways, they were remarkably successful, right? In the first day or two of the war, the supreme leader and most of the more senior leaders of Iran were eliminated.
Correct.
I think what both the U.S. and Israel underestimated was that the Islamic Republic was much more deep than just at the very top. And so I think once regime change became unlikely, if not impossible, it became very unlikely that the U.S. was going to walk away a winner from this war. So one might praise Trump for cutting his losses sooner rather than dragging this out into a ground war that became a quagmire like Afghanistan and Iraq.
Right.
That doesn't, though, negate the fact that assuming these 10 points actually hold, it is a massive strategic defeat for the United States. It's a defeat for the Gulf states like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE. And it does, in some ways, perversely strengthen Iran's power in the region.
Before I let you go, given the fact that this is all also happening in the build-up to the midterm polls towards the end of the year, sometime in November, do you believe that there could potentially be a serious backlash that President Trump might face in the event that he decides to escalate matters, trying to convey a narrative to the American public that the ceasefire is fragile, that Iran has not lived up to its commitments?
Oh, yes. This has been a big political defeat for Donald Trump, no doubt. I mean, even within his own coalition, you've seen some of the MAGA, more prominent members of the MAGA coalition say, we don't support this war. We don't support what you're doing. This isn't what I voted for. So it's hard for me to see how this does anything but damage Trump's and the Republicans' chances in the midterms. Perhaps one of the calculus that Trump has now is, it's April. You still have, maybe 6 months or so until those elections. Maybe by trying to cut his losses now, he can try to change the channel and develop a new narrative going into those midterm contests.
All right, we'll wait and see as to how things unfold. Many thanks, Dr. Fishman, for speaking to us and sharing your insights.
My pleasure.
Thank you, sir.